My name is Jed Wentz. I'm chairing this session on gender, aging, disability, and celebrity. It's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker performer, because we're having a performance session, which I'm always very fond of, which is Susannah self. Let me put on my glasses here, who is a trailblazing composer and conductor of choral music, opera, and interdisciplinary performance work. Also a distinguished career as an international mezzo-soprano in Ghent, Lyon, Salzburg, Luxembourg. Trained in composition, conducting and singing at the Royal College of Music, of course, in London, Cambridge University, and the Royal Birmingham Conservatoire, where a doctorate was achieved. Scholarships from the Royal Society of the Arts Banff Centre in Canada, and studied with John Cage, and a STEAM scholarship for her PhD. I give you the floor.
Pull the corset tighter and you'll faint. Get rid of all your flabbiness. Shape your curves with finesse. Oh, corset story is a tale of pulling out all the strings. Feel liberated. Feel pulled in, the corset will make you win. I was a sinner, I was a saint, I was a winner, I was too straight. I wasn't enough, I was way too tough, I was way too much. I needed a crutch to lean on. Putting on a corset is not a solo enterprise. It takes two to realize, 'cause this is a story of great restraint. Pull the corset tighter and you'll faint. Get rid of all your flabbiness. Shape your curves with finesse. Oh, corset story is a tale of pulling out all the strings. Feel liberated, feel pulled in. The corset will make you win. Pull a little bit tighter, pull a little bit tighter. The corset will make you win. Pull a little bit tighter, pull a little bit tighter. The corset will make you win. Oh, yeah. In 2013, Bruno Montevani, director of the Paris Conservatoire, said that conducting could be too exerting for women. And Vasily Petrenko said that women would be a sexual distraction. Sexual distraction. Oh, my goodness. Transformation. When I took up conducting, even though my conducting professor furnished me with all the conducting techniques I could possibly wish for, his parting shot was, "Good luck with that, but you're unlikely to get the respect of an orchestra because you are a woman." So it was with a sense of doom that I went to my first orchestral rehearsal. But I had a secret knowledge gifted to me by Barry Wordsworth, director of the Royal Ballet, who said, "Be light, be one of them, be a musician yourself, you'll be fine." And so my conducting went really well. But then I began to say to myself, but you're dressed in this androgynous style. And although I really love men, I'm perfectly happy in my gender assignment body. And it was then that I came up with the idea of wearing a corset under my tuxedo. The perfect combination. When I first put on a corset, I thought it would feel restraining, that I wouldn't be able to breathe, I wouldn't be able to move. But instead, I felt it gave me gravitas and a backbone. I was no longer in the thrall of having to solely be an attractive woman. I could think for myself, and I could feel a brain growing. Yes, I could feel a brain. This happened after that disaster they call the menopause. And I could feel sinews growing in my brain. I was calm and collected. I was no longer in the thrall of my anorexic obsession, or that terrible feeling of feeling too fat. Fat, 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 fat. Now, that's all contained by the corset. But I'm not the woman I used to be. Oh dear, I've forgotten my glasses. I'm definitely not the woman I used to be. Here they are. Woman I used to be. No longer so thin, not just too pretty. not the woman I used to be. Instead, I can compose a cosmic symphony. Cosmic symphony. Cosmic symphony. Now I see the world as it really is. Beautiful but captivated by empty fears. If my hormones could speak to my younger self, they'd say these kind words of love. You are my golden girl. You are my favorite one. You make the sun come out. You make the sun come out. No, I am not the woman I used to be. No longer so thin or just too pretty. No, I am not the woman I used to be. Instead, I can compose a cosmic symphony. Cosmic symphony. Oh, no. I am not the woman I used to be. As I started to explore the constrictions and the freedoms of the corset, it led me to think about Shostakovich. Who was given an ultimatum by Stalin: give up that plinky-plonky music or die. What a conundrum, to have to give up your artistic voice or die. Could you do it? But in Shostakovich's case, he not only reinvented his style to please Stalin, but he drove his oeuvre to a greater level. And that could possibly be why we so much enjoy listening to his music today. In other words, restriction can lead to liberation and freedom. It takes a benign dictator to sort things out. But that wasn't the case for Shostakovich. That's not what he was about. Instead, it was restriction versus freedom that liberated his medium. Tightening, then releasing, pulling the strings together. Stalin had no hold on him, whatever the weather. We are shaped by the calling of our soul. We still have a bad dictator trying to sort things out. But that wasn't the case for Navalny. That's not what he was about. Instead, it was restriction versus freedom that liberated his wife Yulia into his medium. Tightening, then releasing, pulling the strings together. Putin had no hold on him, whatever's verda, we are shaped by the calling of our soul. Have you ever wanted to be a man or wanted to be a woman? Here is my performing partner in Corset Story, Marina Sossi, and this is her drag king. He's called Paul Francis. He's a California dude. And here is Robert Christie, Helden tenor. Nessun dorma. Robert Christie, who, if you hadn't realised, is me, performed The Archaeologist in She Is My Pharaoh for the Tête-à-Tête Festival 2 years ago. Nobody knew it was me. Liberation. But seriously, have you ever wanted to be the other sex? That led Marina and I to explore Fanny and Felix Mendelssohn's music. Because you probably know this already, being academics, Fanny wrote a lot of music for Felix, which he performed under his own name. It's true. And so now there are lots of academics and they say, well, we can tell the difference, can't we? We can tell Felix's music will be all masculine and Fanny's all feminine. But when they did an empirical research project, they couldn't prove that. So there's no such thing as masculine and feminine music. What about Clara Schumann? Well, she was a very fine composer herself, and her father said, don't marry that man, don't marry him, but she did. Schumann said, I am worried about Clara. She has no time to work out her ideas because she has a husband of such imagination and children to look after. Oh dear. Shall we explore this masculine-feminine a little bit more? Imagine what it's like to be a woman. Cross your legs. Cross them. Come on, cross your legs. Twist them round. Put your hands across. Make yourself very small. Don't look directly at me. Imagine you're a geisha girl. Modest. Now undo that. Spread your legs. Man, spread your legs. What does that feel like? Look directly at me. Ah, yes. You know what you want and you're going to get it, aren't you? I am the masculine. I am the feminine. I am the masculine. I am the feminine. So what is my research all about? I'm not sure. Well, as many of you postdoc people may know, it's very hard to get a postdoc, so I continued my research. My research is born out of having been impelled to become an opera singer. Yes, I was sort of impelled on a fence by the director of the Royal College of Music. I went in as a composer, and he said, well, you can't be a composer because you're a woman. You'll never make it. So, I don't have any regrets about this. I became an opera singer. And I played all those roles that dramatic character mezzos play. Witches, bitches, the nurse. Ugh. Boring. I don't identify with any of those characters. And I thought, why aren't the women of agency in opera? Why aren't there, even in new opera, women who pass the Bechdel test? Yeah? Where two women have a conversation, but it's not about somebody they're in love with. And so I thought, you know what? I've got a little pension from the Royal Opera House. I'm going to sell it out and go back to university. And that's what I did. I went off to Cambridge and did an MPhil in composition, and then got my scholarship to Birmingham Conservatoire, where I was paid for 4 years to explore this whole dialogue. And I developed a methodology of composing opera and musical theatre, which I call quilting. So if you take a quilt, it's got many different materials, but they're held together in a pattern or a template. And I thought one of the problems with some contemporary opera is it's just one kind of music for the whole evening. And if you look in the history of opera, say the Magic Flute, each number is a very differently crafted piece of work. Some are very lightweight. Papageno's aria or Pamina's suicide scene is certainly the total corollary to that. And so I developed my methodology, and every year I set myself a provocation. How can I provoke people this year? And so, working with Marina, we came up with this idea of the corset. And you're now watching some extracts from Corset's story. I always say, serious composers need to have some fun. Oh dear, what about Alma? Now, Alma Mahler was a very fine composer, but Mahler wasn't having anything of it. He said, you have to bury your music in the garden. Now, I think she was very canny because we can still access her music, so it must have been a metal box or something, but she did bury it. What do you think she did next, then? Well, she had an affair, of course, with a man called Gropius. You couldn't make it up, could you? Thank God Mahler wasn't my partner, because of the way he treated his wife, called Alma. Even though he drove his composition further. What about Alma? What about Alma? Alma, oh Alma, was made to bury her music in the garden's arbor. Alma, oh Alma, was made to bury her music in the garden's arbor. Well, she had enough of him and drank way too much gin as she composed in the pavilion in the garden's arbor. But then she wept and cried and found her wilder side with her legs up in the air with a new lover. Oh, Alma, oh, Alma, was made to bury her music in the garden's arbor. Alma, oh Alma, was made to bury her music in the garden's arbor. Was made to bury her music, made to bury her music, made to bury her music in the garden's arbor. This is Yulia Navalny, the wife of Navalny, who sadly died in the Soviet Union a couple of years ago. And 2 weeks later, she came to the European Union and gave a speech about him. And I thought that was incredibly brave of her. She epitomizes the kind of woman I would like to see in an opera. In fact, maybe I will write an opera about her. My opera quilt song is all about Rosa Parks. So I like to see women have agency in opera. This song is a tribute to Yulia. There comes a time when a woman must stand up for what is right. There's a time to rest and a time to fight, and a time when truth turns to light. What is happening to this world? I wanna take off and run away. What does it take to show up and face the truth, so that heart and soul have their say? Yulia, oh Yulia. Her face is composed, but her voice wavers. But she never disappears. Her words are compelling, her story. She's lived with this violence for years. She's seeding a garden of hope for everyone. She does not speak or dominate, but holds the sword of truth to the sun. Yulia, oh Yulia, Yulia, oh Yulia. What is happening to this world? What is happening to this world? What is happening to this world? Oh, Yulia, oh, Yulia. For real liberation of men and women, men need to have more space to explore their lives. And so real men are feminists. And in the show, we sing a song, which there isn't enough time to do now. We sing a song to celebrate men. And so we're coming up to the end of my presentation. Have I run out of time? Looks like I've run out of time.
1 more minute.
I've got 1 more minute. Okay. So I will sing you a little of the closing song. I used to pray every night when I believed in God, that He would make me wake up the next morning as a beautiful boy. But then my dreams were shattered into broken bones and sticks and stones and things that hurt and things that hurt and sting. 'Cause what remains when the music ends? What remains when the music ends? What remains when the music ends? What remains when the music ends?
Thank you so much, Susannah. That was really fantastic. Really great. Our next speaker is Daniele Palma, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Florence, developing a project on the cultural history of vocal pedagogy in the age of mass media. And he's adjunct professor of contemporary music at the University of Ferrara. His research focuses on 19th and 20th century voice cultures, the media archaeology of opera and amateur musical practices. He is co-editor of Sounds of the Pandemic and author of the monograph Recording Voices. And he is currently working on a second monograph dedicated to the use of talking machines in vocal pedagogy during the acoustic era. Please.
Grazie. It was fantastic. So, back to boring stuff. I am currently developing a project at the University of Florence that I will try and submit in response to the 2026 ERC starting grant call, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. The acronym and title are Voice Cult, Ecologies of Vocal Cultivation in 20th and 21st Century Musicking. In this project, I focus on the transmission of vocal knowledge, hence on the systems, pedagogical ideals, teaching practices, and identity politics of professional vocal cultivation in the last 100 years or so. I will focus on Italy and the UK, but I have no time to explain this in detail. I attempt to explore the intersection of the history of institutions, the history of singing, and the sociology of professions. Thus, I take into account different processes, such as the construction of aesthetic codes across time and geography, the establishment of institutional status for specific singing practices, and the identity projections, social expectations, and accessibility measures that sustain the cultural value of singing practices and establish them as a cultural patrimony. Today, I will explore these topics by addressing the question of how former divos or divas, in my case divas, manage and negotiate their celebrity status after retirement in the teaching environment. I will focus on two examples. First, using archival material from the New York Public Library, I will outline the activities of Marcella Sembrich at the Juilliard School and the Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia in the 1920s. Secondly, I will briefly discuss the work of Lotte Lehmann at the Music Academy of the West in the 1950s, focusing on how she taught Schumann's Dichterliebe. As I will try to show, the transmission of vocal knowledge often involves a process of rethinking one's voice and role within a given tradition, especially when teaching involves transnational exchange. This is the case with Sembrich and Lehmann, both European expats who brought Italian and German traditions overseas. In the end, framing divos or divas within the educational environments they inhabit and shape can broaden the scope of our historiographies of their stardom, as Hilary has perfectly shown today, while at the same time casting light on singing as cultural heritage. Well, let's start by providing a bit of a context regarding the United States, even though I must admit my survey is mostly confined to the East Coast. In the decades under review, in my presentation, we could enlist events and phenomena such as the establishment of local music academies and educational institutions, such as the already mentioned Institute of Musical Art in New York, founded in 1905, and then later the Juilliard School, and the Curtis in Philadelphia, founded in 1924. The rise of the Metropolitan Opera in New York as one of the most important opera houses in the global north, the attraction that this and other such venues exerted on first-rate artists, and the consequent establishment of an international star system. Conversely, the promotion of opera in English and the quest for the creation of an American opera, and the cognate rise of the voice culture movement, which, as Scott Carter has written, attempted, quote, to refine elocutionary and singing practices in order to produce standard vocal expressions representative of the nation's cultural, economical, and political achievements, end quotes. And finally, the introduction of reproduction technologies, from the phonograph to the talkies and television, and the emergence of popular music as an autonomous field. Against this backdrop, we may ask how and where singing was studied in the United States in the late 19th century. And it wouldn't be inaccurate to say, as Hilary again pointed out, that singing was studied in Europe. An initial phase of training took place locally and was often private, as there were no public or national conservatories like those that had existed overseas for at least a century. In the UK, the Royal Academy of Music was founded in 1822 or 25, I don't remember well. In a second stage, the more mature pupils undertook onerous journeys to the major European cities to study with various celebrated maestros, often more than one at a time, with unimaginable confusion between different terminologies and teaching techniques. The aim was to secure a first theatrical engagement arranged by the maestro or impresario in a Europe sometimes perceived as a single indistinct homeland of opera. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes it was. All these began to change around the turn of the 20th century. That's when Sembrich comes into the picture. Praxeda Marcelina Kochanska, I don't know Polish, I'm sorry, was born in Poland in 1858. In 1875, she enrolled in the violin class at the Universität für Musik und Darstellende Kunst in Vienna, but soon abandoned the Stradivari mouse to devote herself entirely to bel canto coloratura. As early as 1876, she pursued this endeavor in Milan under the tutelage of Giovanni Battista Lamperti and later his father Francesco. Apart from their well-known rivalry between the two, in Italy and Europe of the time, the two Lampertis embodied the golden tradition, golden principles of bel canto, a term just as problematic as their supposed pedagogical filiation from the 18th century Bolognese school of castrato Antonio Bernacchi. Be as it may be, Sembrich ascended the international stage and that of the Metropolitan as early as 1883, with a distinct and discernible patent of vocal Italianism, all the more so because she expressed herself in a repertoire predating Giuseppe Verdi's empire. Sembridge settled permanently in the United States by the turn of the century, singing at the Met until 1909 and then concluding her concert career in 1917. From that year, the soprano embarked on a long and fruitful career as a singing teacher, initially at Juilliard and subsequently from 1924 at the Curtis Institute in Philadelphia. In the latter case, Sembridge was selected by the institution's founder, Mary Louise Curtis Bock, to initiate and direct the singing class. And this allowed Sembridge to dictate the line and choose her own collaborators, in some cases selecting them from among her former students at Juilliard. The contracts and payment notes preserved in the folders of the public library make it possible to quantify the value attributed to Sembridge and, by extension, to opera singing. At Curtis, Sembridge was remunerated a fixed sum of $30,000 per academic year in return for delivering 8 hours of teaching per week and undertaking the commitment not to offer any further private lesson in the city area. Employment at the Juilliard, conversely, yielded a salary ranging from $1,500 to $3,900 per month, contingent on the number of hours allocated. In 1928 alone, the year for which the most reliable evidence exists, and for institutional activities only, she also had private lessons, Sembridge earned $54,900, which equates to the most modest sum of approximately $1 million in today's currency. Given the values at stake, it is not surprising that from the 1920s onwards, Sembridge also became a strong promoter of the creation of an American opera. She understood it as a new repertoire composed by Americans, based on American stories, performed by local singers, and through this new national opera, these singers could undertake the necessary apprenticeship to eventually reach international opera. That is, for her, the high context of the Metropolitan or Covent Garden, not La Scala, not Staatsoper in Vienna, which were national theatre for her. All this was rooted in a precise cultural policy. We should not remain any longer in the position of a rich province dependent on Europe for our musical life and forcing our own talents to acquire the status of an importation through making a flame in the old world before we accept and support them. Any reference to contemporary facts is unintentional. One of the many practical spin-offs of these ideas was the organization of an operating acting class at Curtis, which produced annual stagings of emblazoned titles. Several letters in the public library's archives show that in 1928 and 1921, former Staatsoper director Willem von Wiemetal was set to direct selected acts from 20 operas, ranging from Ermanno Wolfs-Ferrari's Il segreto di Susannah to Richard Strauss' Der Rosenkavalier. However, this latter was not realized as Sembridge believed that no pupil could perform it. The public library also preserves materials that provide insights into Sembridge's teaching methods, including articles published in periodicals, such as the one from which I took the quote before, handwritten notes relating to auditions of aspiring students, correspondence with leading students engaged in production in the United States or Germany, such as the Italian-American Dusolina Giannini, and finally an anonymous handwritten report from 1928 containing reminiscence by an unknown Denise about what she had learned from the Polish soprano. Nothing particularly surprising emerged from the handwritten notes by Sembridge. A letter with no indication of addressee reads, "You know what a struggle it was for you to sing with your tongue relaxed, so do not fall into some habit again of raising it when you sing pianos or decrescendos. Do practice scales, arpeggios, staccatis every day as much as possible to increase flexibility, also sustain tones, making crescendos and decrescendos, etc., etc." Short, Sembridge essentially repeats what the Lampertis taught her from the relaxed tongue to the sustained sounds and the infamous Messa di Voce. Something more interesting emerges from the 1928 report. Apart from exquisitely technical matters such as the idea to think of drinking the breath in order to have a good legato, which is something very modern for the age, Denise's note insists on one particular point. The mind can become the force behind the difficulty by seeking avenues of approach, I quote, I'm quoting, which will lessen and overcome the trouble in question. Herein lie demands for great devotion and sacrifice for the sake of one's voice and art, as relative to the amount of time spent in deep thought and meditation. Many of Madame's pupils will no doubt catch my meaning, at least the deep thinkers will catch my meaning, and many of them became deep thinkers as a result of their treasured instructions. Here we have something very different from the Italian pedagogical tradition about singing, because that tradition was substantially pragmatic, artisanal, based on relational forms between teacher and pupil that were articulated over a long period of time, often even through cohabitation and the creation of families rather than schools. Denise's notes, on the other hand, frame the practice of singing first and foremost as an intellectual activity, a cultivation of thought that fits into a sort of psychologizing strand of vocal art, which is opposed to the rampart mechanicism originating from Manuel Garcia Son's treatise, and diverges from the Italian tradition from which the Sembridge approach originated. Of course, this was due also to a different relational system based on a direct commercial exchange, more suited to a production system that between the late 19th and early 20th century saw the final victory of the publisher and agent over the impresario. Let's now turn to the second case. Diva and leader specialist. This is how the New York Times decided to subtitle the obituary of Lotte Lehmann on 27 August 1976 again. Lehmann, one of the most illustrious singers-actresses of the first half of the 20th century, was perceived as a diva, certainly, but above all, perhaps, she was taught as a specialist in the repertoire of 19th century German Lied, one that had gained cultural recognition in the United States only from a few decades. There were plenty of reasons for attributing such authority to her. Lehmann's interest in the Lied developed after an international debut in 1924 under Bruno Walter at the Royal Opera House here in the UK. From then on, the Salzburg Festival became Lehmann's favorite destination for Liederabenden, but however, it was in the United States that her specialized career truly flourished, particularly after she permanently relocated to New York in 1938 after the Anschluss. From her national debut in Chicago in 1930, she gave 117 opera performances against 277 Lieder recitals. As if that were not enough, after her retirement, Lehmann became one of the key figures in establishing the Music Academy of the West in Santa Barbara, California, where she had been living since 1943. From 1947 onwards, she embarked on a long career as a teacher of vocal interpretation, delivering annual masterclasses in Santa Barbara and London's Wingmore Hall, as well as private lessons at her home overlooking the Pacific. In this vein, between It isn't working. Why? Between 1946, no, è bloccato. Let's see. It's good, now it's good. Between 1945 and 1971, Lehmann published 2 volumes devoted to the interpretation of opera roles and 2 Lied or Lieder cycles, praised by critics as a treasure trove from one of the most important prima donnas alive. These volumes not only shed light on how Lehmann approached her chosen repertoire, but also on how she intended to preserve it by adapting her cultural and pedagogical vision to the needs of new generations of American singers. Let's take as a paradigmatic example Im Rhein, im heiligen Strome, the 6th Lied from Schumann's Dichterliebe. Here the poetic the poetic eye, finds themselves in Cologne Cathedral in the presence of a votive effigy of the Virgin, of goldenen Leder gemalt, painted on golden leather, and observing it, the features of the sacred figure seem to mingle with those of the beloved to the point of total confusion, mirroring the tangle of existence, the Lebenswildnis of the poetic self. The didactic writings show that Lehmann subdivided the piece into three distinct emotional moments. After the initial description of the cathedral, the performer is asked to convey sacred astonishment and tender melancholy through a combination of timbral qualities and bodily action, such as a veiled piano, for example, which implies an unexpected sacrifice of vocal beauty for the sake of expression, and actions such as gazing upwards and smiling. Such gestures, of course, would be completely erased from any sound recording, comprised those of Lehmann, but yet they are fundamental as the characterization of the final part of the piece rests on them alone. Here, the singing falls, silent, and the piano repeats the opening bars. The singer's silent action links im Rein to the subsequent Ich grolle nicht. Bowing the head of the singer signals the transition from melancholy to pain and misery, and this foreshadows the poetic Ich, full and bitter realization of how empty the beloved's promise was. I don't have time for a more detailed analysis, but the painting is from Lehmann, that one on the left. From Lehmann's writings, I've inferred that this silent action might have been modeled on a monologue by American actress Ruth Draper, and in particular a scene from a cycle of Draper entitled A Church in Italy. As we can infer from this example, the didactic writings and further media reflections, such as a 1961 television recording of the Santa Barbara masterclasses, clearly show that Lehmann superimposes a dramaturgy of a own on the compositional outline and the poetic text. In this respect, I would describe Lehmann's interpretive agency as a palimpsest. The superimposed dramaturgy does not necessarily align with the authorial project, but rather recombines elements drawn from the singer's most diverse experiences, such as Draper's monologue. Lehmann's agency then rests on the underlying principle that, quote, leader singing can be a dramatic scene, seized from the purely spiritual and transformed into the pulse beats of reality. At this point, two words come to mind: overseas and tradition. It's normal, it's empty. And what I'm going to say equally applies to both cases that I have discussed. It is clear that Lehmann's objectives were not foreign to the cultural tradition of the German Lied, and in particular to the conceptual shift from morceau to opus identified by historians in Schumann's work. While Lehmann's thinking on the art of Lied singing remained consistent with this idea, she also sought to adapt an exquisitely European vision to the needs of the other cultural context of the United States. This resulted in interference between two possible articulations of the concept of tradition. On the one hand, there is tradition with a capital T, that is the repertoire, the Lied, perceived as a heritage and presented as a heritage to be safeguarded, all the more so after the war. On the other hand, there are performative traditions, the stylistic, vocal, proxemic customs and traits that the soprano associated with her chosen repertoires, and that could only be preserved through forms of reactivation. The agency of both Sembrich and Lehmann seems to lie in this productive relationship between affective projections of their role as cultural agents, as celebrities, and the broader ecologies of transnational transmission of musical knowledge. And in these ecologies, tradition and celebrity are mutually intertwined. Both singer can pass on tradition because they are celebrities. At the same time, their celebrity status enables them to adapt tradition, to modify tradition, to the changing needs of their time. I don't have any definitive conclusions. I'm sorry about that. These are just snapshots of ongoing research, and I look forward for any suggestion. The final thing that I'd like to say is that despite all my efforts, I haven't been able to identify the Denise who wrote the 1928 report on Sembrich. I fear that she may have been one of the many singing students who simply didn't make it. In the last few years, I started to thinking of the history of singing. It might be a little bit macabre, but it is so, in my mind, as a long pathway paved with the bodies and souls of those who didn't make it. And not to mention the fact that these people who didn't make it often become a very interesting part of the audience, and Nicolò maybe can tell us something about that. I feel that there's a productive energy, something difficult to investigate, of course, but full of dignity and grace. And I'm trying to include somehow this phenomena in my project. I don't know how yet, but I would like to engage with the many, many history of failures that are beneath the glittering surface of celebrated performance. I don't know if this will succeed, but maybe the time has come to include in the picture also the losers and treat them with all the kindness they deserve. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniele. Beautifully in time. Now we're moving to an online presentation, we hope. Ecoli Davidson is a PhD student in musicology, specializing in music and disability. She earned her master's degree at the University of British Columbia, where she began exploring the intersection of sound, identity, and representation, particularly focusing on how disability is portrayed in musical contexts. As an advocate for inclusion and representation, Davidson is committed to challenging conventional narratives in music and amplifying the visibility of disabled voices in academic and performance spaces. Her work calls for a more inclusive approach to musicology, integrating diverse perspectives to reflect a more equitable cultural landscape. Davidson's academic journey is driven by her dedication to both scholarly research and social advocacy for disability rights and representation in the arts. And this is a pre-recorded presentation, but Echo is online, and we will be able, we hope, to take questions for her at the end.
On June 9th, 2019, while helping my mother manage her chronic pain, we sat together watching the Tony Awards, an ordinary night that unexpectedly opened up a radical new vision of what musical theater could be. When Ali Stroker, the first wheelchair user to star in a Broadway musical, performed I Cain't Say No from Daniel Fish's revival of Oklahoma, we both felt something shift. Here was a white woman in a wheelchair wearing a purple tank top, a low-cut denim skirt, and a black choker necklace. My mother and I looked at each other in astonishment. We had never seen a woman in a wheelchair on a Broadway stage before. As the opening notes rang out, Stroker's bright twang caught my ear. Her voice was both precise and playful, and the way she moved her wheelchair, fluidly and rhythmically, commanded the stage with a kind of sensual authority. She radiated joy, humor, vitality, and desire. Our reactions were different, though equally intense. I was struck by the performance's aesthetic boldness, by the sheer charisma and confidence of Stroker's presence. My mother, a lifelong fan of musical theater, a musician, and a wheelchair user herself, responded on a deeply personal, parasocial level. Before Stroker even began to sing, she whispered, "It's about time." She immediately recognized what I had not yet fully understood, that this was a historic moment of representation long overdue, and more than that, she saw in Stroker not tokenism but belonging, a performer whose presence redefined what a Broadway leading lady could look and move like. Stroker's Ado Annie, like Fish's Oklahoma, more broadly disrupts the settler colonial myth of a unified, idealized American frontier. Rather than reinforcing that nostalgic fiction, this revival foregrounds bodies and voices historically excluded from it, most strikingly through Stroker's unapologetically sexual, charismatic, and disabled embodiment. Her performance resists containment. It refuses to be inspirational in the conventional sense and instead insists on desire, excess, and theatrical power. Today, I'll examine how Stroker's voice and movement intervene in normative representations of femininity, how her performance reframes disability as a generative form of stage presence, and how Oklahoma itself becomes a site of aesthetic and political contradiction. I'll also turn to Rebecca Naomi Jones' Laurie to think about how race, voice, and embodiment intersect in this production, further complicating its vision of American identity. Together, these performances raise difficult and urgent questions about who is allowed to desire, to speak, to belong, and at what cost. To understand the subversive musical and choreographic aesthetics of Stroker's portrayal of Ado Annie, the work of philosopher Judith Butler offers a useful point of entry. In Gender Trouble, Butler famously describes gender as a socially constructed performance produced through repetition and social regulation. This realization, she argues, can lead to the mobilization, subversive confusion, and proliferation of constitutive categories. In Bodies That Matter, Butler expands on this idea, emphasizing that gender is not fixed but performative, fluid and contingent, open to disruption and resignification. While Butler theorizes gender is an unconscious process of iteration, disability complicates this framework. Disabled people are often acutely aware of how they perform disability, whether or not they identify with the performances expected of them. As Rosemary Garland Thompson writes, disabled people must use charm, intimidation, ardor, deference, humor, or entertainment to relieve non-disabled people of their discomfort. Artistic performance, especially on stage, intensifies these dynamics. Petra Kuppers observes that when disabled people perform, they are often not primarily seen as performers but disabled people. The disabled body is naturally about disability. That is, the audience frequently foregrounds disability before considering craft or artistry. This dynamic is especially charged in musical theater. Musicologist Raymond Knapp notes that Broadway musicals often reinforce pernicious stereotypes of disability. In productions like Next to Normal, The Music Man, and Wicked, he argues the staging automatically amplifies stigmatized bodily difference. Disabled performers must therefore anticipate such responses and intervene strategically to reframe or resist the stigmatizing gaze. Ali Stroker has been outspoken about these structural inequities. She explains, I would like to see disabled actors cast in all different kinds of roles, not just parts for somebody who's disabled. This sentiment aligns with what Jessica Holmes describes as the non-coherence of disability in performance. Disability is not a stable or legible symbol. It is always being negotiated through scenes of reception, mediation, and embodied labor. While musical theater has long relied on productive narratives and exclusionary casting practice, Holmes reminds us that disability is by no means a coherent, conventionalized sign eliciting a naturalized set of impressions, reactions, and social interactions. She critiques critical frameworks that assume able-bodied audiences can only respond with pity or discomfort, arguing instead for models that allow for meaningful engagement. Stigmatization in this view is never fixed, it is provisional and open to challenge. As Butler might put it is precisely through performance that stigma can be troubled, subverted, or even reversed. Stroker actively embraces this possibility. She says, when I'm on stage, I'm telling the audience, no, you can look, and you can watch, and you can begin to understand, and you can be a part of this world. Rather than deflecting attention from her wheelchair, she invites it, asking audiences to see her body not as something to be pitied or ignored, but as integral to the story. Being on stage and being in a chair and inviting people to watch and look, she continues, is probably the most empowering thing that has ever happened to me. She also speaks openly about her sexuality. In a 2018 Teen Vogue interview, she declared, I arrived in my sexual power. This public articulation directly challenges the widespread and harmful assumption that disabled people are asexual. By claiming space for sexual agency, Stroker re-embodies disability as a desirous, complex, and powerful, a kind of disability sexuality trouble. Ado Annie's solo I Cain't Say No becomes a site where these themes converge. The lyrics are bold in their articulation of sexual desire. I'm just a girl who can't say no. I'm in a terrible fix. I always say, come on, let's go, just when I ought to say nix. Stroker's vocal performance underscores this defiance. She uses wide leaps, belted chest voice, glissandi, and cracks, all framed within a country-inflected texture. These are techniques long associated with power and emotional expressivity. Yet they also challenge ableist sonic norms that have historically excluded disabled voices from musical theater's aesthetic ideals. Jessica Holmes argues that the perceived audibility of power in disabled performers destabilizes normative listening expectations. Nina Sun-Eidsham similarly critiques the idea of voice as a transparent sign of identity. Stroker's voice unsettles such assumptions. It forces us to ask how power, sexiness, and theatrical presence are constructed in the first place, and by whom. While singing, Stroker also executes compelling choreographic gestures. She smacks a table, flirts with audience members, and propels her wheelchair in wide arcs. The immersive staging of Fish's Oklahoma enables her to engage the audience more intimately. Here, Steph Carrasso's concept of multimodal listening is useful. Stroker's performance is not just heard, but felt, through sound, sight, space, and movement. Her body and voice become part of a full sensory environment, embodied, relational, impossible to ignore. I want to now turn to Rebecca Naomi Jones' performance as Laurie, to consider how her casting not only complicates the musical's racial politics, but also configures the emotional and ideological stakes of the role itself. Jones' casting as Laurie doesn't simply diversify Oklahoma. It transforms the story being told and unsettles the ideological terrain of the musical itself. As the first black woman to portray Laurie on Broadway, Jones steps into a role historically constructed around ideals of white rural femininity. Chaste but desirable, emotionally intuitive, symbolically tethered to the land. Laurie has long functioned as a vessel for the frontier myth, projecting an image of American innocence that is explicitly racialized. Her presence on stage, as dreamer, object of desire, and imagined homemaker, has been bound up in what Saidiya Hartman terms the afterlife of slavery, the persistent ways that black absence and white ideality shape American cultural memory. Jones' performance disrupts this visual and sonic continuity. Her embodiment of Laurie is not colorblind casting. It is a recalibration of the role's affective and political meaning. Her voice does not merely carry the score, it reanimates Laurie's longing, anger, and reticence through the lived textures of black womanhood in the United States. As Bell Hooks reminds us, black women's expressive labor has too often been aestheticized or appropriated without acknowledgement of its political charge. Jones reclaims that charge. Her performance renders visible the racial exclusions that have long structured Oklahoma's narrative, while also insisting on Laurie's full humanity, her complexity, ambivalence, and interior life. From a dramaturgical perspective, this is not simply a question of access or visibility. Jones' casting reframes the musical as a contested site of racial narrative. What does it mean to center a black woman within a story historically organized around whiteness, settler futurity, and heteronormative romance? As scholars like Daphne Brooks and Nadine George Graves have argued, the appearance of black women in historically white theatrical landscapes often functions as both performance and disruption. The narrative no longer coheres in the same way. It cannot. The presumed universality of whiteness is fractured by Jones' presence, which calls attention to the mythologies that underwrite the very idea of Americanness. That is not to say that Jones plays against the role. Her performance is nuanced, affectively rich, and precisely musical, but her racialized embodiment reshapes the role's historical legibility. Jose Esteban Munoz's concept of disidentification is useful here. Jones neither fully assimilates into the white framework of Laurie nor entirely rejects it. Instead, she performs through the role, repurposing it, remaking it, rendering Oklahoma newly legible and politically unstable. In this way, her Laurie is not an insertion into an old story, but an invitation to imagine a different one. This transformation becomes even more powerful in the ensemble number Many a New Day. In this scene, Laurie, Ado Annie, and Aunt Eller sing together in a shared register of emotional resilience. The lyrics offer a declaration of refusal. Many a new face will please my eye, many a new love will find me. But when this trio is performed by a black woman, a disabled woman, and an older white woman, that refusal is reframed. Not just as personal strength, but as collective survivance across histories of racial, gendered, and bodily marginalization. Stroker participates here in what Jessica Holmes calls ensemble embodiment, aligning her voice and body with others without collapsing difference. Their voices blend in harmony, but their embodied experience remains distinct. The staging reinforces this. Aunt Eller and Lori walk, Annie rolls in her chair. These choreographic differences are not smoothed over, they're woven into the fabric of the scene. What emerges is not sameness, but solidarity, an acknowledgement that bodies move differently, grieve differently, and yet belong in relation. This moment enacts what Fred Moten calls fugivity, a refusal to be fully captured by dominant forms of representation or legibility. The trio does not resolve into a singular narrative of white rural womanhood as the original Oklahoma might have demanded. Instead, it becomes what Munoz terms a utopian performative, a moment that gestures towards a world not yet realized where difference is not managed but shared. The ensemble does not erase the politics of race or disability, it stages them together. In doing so, it reclaims the sonic space of the musical not as a fantasy of national cohesion, but as a site of plural, often incommensurable identities moving in coordination, if not always in unity. Taken together, Jones and Stroker's performances reframe the terms of theatrical presence. Stroker's voice is not merely heard, it is spatialized and embodied. What Carrie Sandall calls a crip aesthetic, an artistry grounded in bodily difference, improvisation, and resistance. Jones' Laurie, meanwhile, performs a racial dissonance within a genre long defined by exclusion. Their duet of difference is not a rupture, but a refusal to be reduced, contained, or assimilated. Instead, they make room for a different kind of frontier, one not defined by conquest, but by care, contingency, and collective reimagining. Audience responses to Oklahoma were deeply divided. For some, Daniel Fish's revival was a revelation, raw, stripped down, and emotionally immediate. For others, it felt disorienting, even alienating. Reviews ranged from raves about its daring reimagining to confusion or discomfort with its darker tone and subversive aesthetics. Much of this reaction centered on the casting and vocal performances, especially those of Ali Stroker and Rebecca Naomi Jones. On YouTube, comments on Stroker's Tony Award performance describe her voice as empowering, iconic, and electrifying. Viewers praised her charisma and vocal control, often framing her presence as a moment of inspiration or historic breakthrough. Rolling Stone echoed this sentiment, calling attention to her powerhouse voice. Kristen Chenoweth, a Broadway star herself, declared, "Allie's success tells us the rules have changed." These responses show how public discourse often codifies Stroker's vocality as triumph, something to be celebrated, even idolized. Yet such celebration can risk slipping into exceptionalism, positioning Stroker as a singular figure rather than part of a broader movement for disability justice and inclusion. As Nina Sun-Eidsheimer reminds us, voice is never just voice. It is always mediated by cultural expectations about whose sound is legible, desirable, or powerful. In Stroker's case, her voice was widely embraced, but often flattened into an image of empowerment rather than engaged as a complex sonic and embodied practice. Rebecca Naomi Jones, meanwhile, received more general praise for her grounded, emotionally layered performance. While her presence was not always the focal point of media discourse, many critics noted the quiet power of her interpretation, her ability to hold space with restraint, nuance, and inner tension. Some audience members described her performance as haunting, refreshingly understated, or more human than heroic. In contrast to Stroker's media-celebrated vocality, Jones' performance circulated less through viral clips and more through word of mouth and critical reflection. Together, the reception of these two performers reflects the broader ambivalence surrounding the production. It asked audiences to sit with discomfort, to let go of nostalgia, and to listen differently, to race, to disability, and to the stories we think we already know. Some embraced that challenge and others resisted it, but the fact that Oklahoma could provoke such a range of reactions signals the very stakes of its radical reimagining. So what was Oklahoma doing in 2019, and what does it mean to revisit the production now in 2025 through the lens of actor, singer, and celebrity culture? At the time, Daniel Fish's revival felt like a rupture in the Broadway landscape. It did what few revivals dare to do. It unearthed the violence embedded in the musical's core and staged it plainly, without apology or romantic veil. It didn't just reinterpret Oklahoma, it exposed it, and it did so through its actors' bodies and voices. In this production, celebrity didn't just mean frame, it meant risk, resonance, and political weight.
Stroker and Jones didn't simply perform their roles. They transformed the terrain of theatrical presence. Stroker's casting as Ado Annie made her the first wheelchair user to star in a Broadway musical, and with that came enormous symbolic visibility. But it was her performance, her voice, her physicality, her unapologetic charisma that rewrote the terms of disabled celebrity. She did not perform around her disability or despite it. She centered it as a site of sexual agency, comic timing, vocal virtuosity, and star power. As her profile rose in the media, her voice was celebrated as empowering and iconic, though often with the subtext of exceptionality, an undercurrent that both elevates and isolates disabled performers in popular discourse. Rebecca Naomi Jones, meanwhile, brought a quieter but equally subversive presence to the role of Laurie. As the first Black woman to play the role on Broadway, her casting fundamentally disrupted the racial fantasy the musical had long upheld. Her voice and affect reframed Laurie not as a vessel of white feminine innocence, but as a complex subject, a woman whose guarded hope and withheld vulnerability resonated with a deeper, racialized history of performance and dispossession. She may not have been celebrated in the same public-facing ways as Stroker, but her performance was no less radical. In fact, part of what makes it powerful is how it resists the spectacle of redemption or breakthrough. It does not seek celebrity, it insists on its presence. It also matters that this production emerged during the Trump administration, a time when the machinery of the state was actively working to entrench ableism, white supremacy, and patriarchal nationalism under the guise of returning to an imagined past. Disability protections were rolled back, the Americans with Disabilities Act was quietly eroded. Strength and independence were reframed as tools of exclusion, casting disabled lives as burdens. Simultaneously, state-sanctioned violence against Black communities intensified, while political rhetoric sanctified law and order as a nationalist virtue. The spectacle of inclusion, diverse casts, viral moments, symbolic firsts, were frequently weaponized to obscure ongoing harm. In that climate, Oklahoma became more than a revival. It became an indictment. The production refused to soothe. It showed how America's foundational myths of frontier, morality, white innocence, heteronormative harmony were themselves aesthetic performances meant to justify violence and erase difference. And in that exposed space, both Stroker and Jones made their presence felt. Stroker's performance in this context was not just inspirational, it was insubordinate. Jones-Laurie worked in counterpoint. Her presence did not fit neatly into the logic of inspiration or empowerment. It was too quiet, too complicated, too haunted. Looking back from 2025, we now understand that this Oklahoma wasn't just a revival, it was a reckoning. And its cultural impact wasn't just theatrical, it was celebrity making in the fullest sense, shaping how actors, singers, and bodies become legible as symbols of progress, disruption, or discomfort. The production asked, what does it mean to be cast? What does it mean to be seen as a star, as a problem, as a possibility? And whose bodies are permitted to carry meaning? Stroker and Jones didn't simply perform, they intervened. Their presence destabilized the racial and able-bodied hierarchies that Broadway and America too often reproduces. And as the Trump administration curated a vision of the nation grounded in nostalgia, exclusion, and control, and continues to do so, this Oklahoma staged another kind of America, fractured, unfinished, and unwilling to pretend otherwise. Their performances didn't fix the story, they made it visible. And in doing so, they revealed something essential about how American celebrity functions at the intersection of race, disability, gender, and national myth. Their visibility didn't end oppression, but it interrupted the fantasy that visibility alone is enough. That interruption is the legacy we're still living in. Thank you.
So now please take the customary 5 minutes to discuss. So can I just take the microphone?
And then try not to.
Right. And do you need a little more time for echo or? Sorry?
Maybe a little bit.
Okay. So I can ask if the first question cannot be for echo. Okay. Time is up. We are still struggling a bit with the technology for echo. So perhaps if we take a question not for echo first, we can then have solved the problem so that she can speak to us. She hears us, but we're not hearing her. Time is up. We are still struggling a bit with the technology.
Oh,
So perhaps
music
if
to
we
my
take a
ears.
question not for echo first, we can then have solved the problem. So
there
that
may
she
be
can
something
speak
of
to
a
us.
delay.
She hears us, but
Can we take a question, please? Any questions?
still struggling a bit with.
Everyone wants to ask a question for echo. That's clear. Yes? Yes.
Okay, we were just in the middle of a discussion and I would really like to continue it and also to ask the other presenters whether they think there's ageism at play. For example, Ego briefly touched upon that there's a scene where 3 people are singing, so it's a wheelchair user and women of color and also an elderly woman, if I understood correctly. How does this work? There's ageism at play, for example.
Who would like to answer that? You've got a mic, I think.
I've got a microphone. Yeah, well, no, we were having a really interesting conversation about that, about ageism, and particularly I think you were framing it in terms of how do young women composers feel. And that's really interesting because I teach a lot of young women composers at the Guildhall Young Artist Programme. So I'm passionate about empowering them. Mostly I feel they're under a lot of pressure, a little bit like opera singers, to conform, to be pretty and to write pretty music. So often you'll see in competitions or opportunities that women get opportunities in community composing for community groups or sound art. So they're still encountering being marginalised and don't necessarily dare write more muscular music, even though they're totally capable of doing it. So, there's often quite a struggle with me and my young students. One of the things they'll say is, so this is really the opposite to ageism for young people, in the sense that they don't have enough courage up their sleeve to take the risk. So they'll say, I'm not going to go in for that because I might not win. And I say, don't be ridiculous. Of course you won't win, but you must go in, because if you don't, you certainly won't. And so there's that sort of kind of narrative.
Do you have anything to add to that, or? And echoes not.
I don't think.
And so there's that sort of kind of narrative.
All right, okay. So are we giving up then on?
You can't get around. Yes.
We just heard her. Yeah.
And echoes not. No, it's like a.
But it sounds like a. Oh, maybe it was.
All right, okay. So are we giving up? It's very delayed. Yeah. Wow, unfortunate. I'm very sorry about that. Do we have other questions?
That question is for Susannah.
No, it's like.
What is your opinion on non-gendered role in operas? Like maybe, like a potential thing in future operas, or like singers doing both female and male roles, or so as like compositions. Can composition in the future that has masculinity and feminine aspect within a work, like what is your thoughts about it?
That's a lovely question. I mean, the truth is that we all contain masculine and feminine, whether we're men or women, and opera has always had that ability to explore those cross-gender and non-binary states. So yes, I say absolutely bring it on. But it's still, we're still a long way off from that in the main opera houses. So my research showed there's still very much a traditional narrative, and there could be some very cogent reasons, for example, why women still have tragic ends even in modern operas, and that's what the academic Catherine Clement talked about in her work, that women are used as sort of kind of metaphors for well-off audiences, to show women in the audience that if they don't behave themselves, they will come to a bad end. So there's a sort of kind of a micro-environment in the opera house generating, allowing the stories not to expand enough. But we can but hope.
Thank you. First, just on that point, this is more of a comment than a question, or a commission idea, but I've always thought that there's a crossover in like Christmas movies and how women always have to be like dead in them. Like there's always like a dead mother or something. And like opera, just I feel like that's something that I would love to see you like work on.
Play a dead mother.
No, push at the Hallmark Christmas opera. I think that's something that, anyway.
The Christmas, okay.
Yeah, just an idea. But I actually had a serious question, which was, I'd love to hear more about your Rosa Parks quilt. Could we hear a bit about that? And just like, I don't know if Echo is going to be able to join us, but just in terms of thinking a bit about, I know race wasn't on the theme of the panel, but...
Well, as I said, I was working with these young musical theatre singers at the Birmingham Ormiston Academy, and they all come from backgrounds where they wouldn't normally get music lessons. They wouldn't be able to afford them and everything. And they were the people who brought up Rosa Parks because I took as a starting point a play about Abraham Lincoln. And they said they wanted something more contemporary. And I then discovered this fabulous quote by Rosa Parks, and she said, when I decided not to move on the bus in 1965 in Birmingham, Alabama, I wanted to cover myself with a quilt like on a winter's night. and that just touched my soul. And I said, well, I want to discover more about quilting and what that symbolism of the quilt, and that's how the whole methodology of the opera developed. And the methodology of the quilting allowed us to explore various narratives from Abraham Lincoln through Rosa Parks, and we also included an allusion to the story of what had happened to the British MP Jo Cox. We didn't actually name her, we called her the Muse, but nevertheless we were exploring all those narratives, and particularly this wonderful female action by non-action, which Rosa Parks exemplified.
Thanks very much for that talk. Just a question about females dressing up as males in opera. I heard Jennifer Johnson give a long talk about the indignities she went through putting on the undergarments and corset in order to transform her body from a female body into a male body. Does that fit with your argument about corset and corsetage?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I'm a great fan of Jennifer Johnson. She's a very outspoken opera singer who has a very conventional and highly successful career. She's a brilliant singer. I think it would be a complicated one for her. I can see why she would have to be maybe sort of made to look something that she wasn't, because she is a big person. So but there's no reason why she shouldn't play those roles. But perhaps she felt it was undignified. She could have said no, I'm not. She's so successful. She doesn't have to do a role if she doesn't want to do it. I think.
She wanted to do the role. She just didn't like the process of doing it.
She didn't like the process of playing a man.
She didn't like the process of putting on all the gear in order to transform her body into a male body.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's necessarily de rigueur that you have to do that.
Okay. A question for Daniele. In your studies, you are focusing on America in this panel. You focused in Europe as well, and if there is some things, a similar path in Europe or generally in one nation of Europe with that kind of path.
Thank you for your question. That's a bit unfortunate because I was planning to include the United States in my project, but as I was saying to Hilary, I am not sure anymore for the geopolitical situation, because in a couple of years I am not sure that I will be able to go to the United States or get a visa for me or one of the people who possibly might work with me at a project, and so I'm erasing the United States from research. I've done research on the United States, I will do something of this research, but who knows? So at the moment I'm guessing I will be focusing the project on Italy and the UK, because this allows me to engage with different repertoires, not only opera, which is not my interest. I'm not interested in working only on operatic singing, but also to work on different traditions, just for example musical. And the United Kingdom might be the best way to get to musical tradition. So there are, of course, similar phenomena. Definitely the similar phenomena. The question is that different operatic or production cultures across the world changed in different ways, in different epochs, and just for example in Italy there are still some ideas of families of singing teachers, private singing teachers who gather around themselves just for their celebrity or because they have good contacts with some impresarios or some agents at the moment. They gather around themselves families of singers, and I've been one of them. in my past, in one of my past life, I'm one of the losers somehow. That's why I'm interested in them.
We have time for one last question.
Thank you. I have a question for Susannah, if that's all right. When you were talking about Yulia Navalny and the oration she made after the murder of Alexei, I couldn't help but be put in mind of Brunhilde and her immolation scene at the end of Götterdämmerung. I wonder, I'd just be really interested to hear you talk through the kind of important differences you see. Is it about the fact that Brunhilde can't be allowed to live after saying what she said? Is it about, I don't know, the realism of the real situation? I'd just love to hear more, if that's okay.
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, if you watch her, you can watch it on YouTube, it's her vulnerability that is so powerful. And so, yeah, I can see your comparison to Brunhilde, although I think I chose, because it's a cabaret show, I chose to write a very simple song that was vulnerable and that wouldn't be sung in an operatic way. So, in a sense, I was deconstructing my voice. But I think in terms of an opera, it would be incredibly exciting because it's a political hot potato, and of course she can't go back to Russia because, you know, when he went back, that was the end for him. But I think opera is like a secular oratorio or something. It has such agency in terms of current events that obviously if you're writing a piece or about something that's happening now or has happened in the recent past, you've got to really reframe it for the sensibility of those people still living. Brunhilde, fortunately, is, but she is a wonderful character. But I think it's the fact that in a way they were such a couple that she is now his mouthpiece, and they almost made that sacrifice. It would make a very powerful opera.
Echo has sent us a text which Emmanuel is going to read for us.
So Echo's replied to all the questions that were asked. So taking them in order, first, your question, Martina, about ageism, I think. I'm speaking as Echo here, so this is not me, I had the opportunity to speak with the actress who played Aunt Ella in this production. She was conscious of how the role is traditionally shaped by ageist assumptions and made intentional choices to bring more spunk and vitality to the character. Still, it's worth noting that Aunt Ella, unlike the younger characters, is not portrayed as a sexual figure, something embedded in the original writing of Oklahoma itself. The script tends to frame older women as wise or wry, but desexualized, a contrast that reinforces age-based boundaries around femininity and desire, and this production didn't radically overturn that dynamic, but the actress's performance gestures towards the possibility of expanding what roles like Aunt Ella can embody. Then in answer to your question about experimentation with cross-gender casting, Echo says that we're definitely seeing more experimentation with cross-gender casting in musical theatre, which is exciting, but it's also not entirely new. Musical theatre has always carried a degree of gender play, whether in the drag traditions of vaudeville, the breeches roles of operetta, or even the early history of Annie Get Your Gun and Peter Pan. What's new is how such casting is now being more explicitly tied to questions of identity politics and visibility. Take, for example, the actress cast as Elphaba in the upcoming Wicked film. There's growing openness to gender diverse or gender non-conforming performers taking on iconic roles. We're also seeing women cast in traditionally male parts like Jesus and Jesus Christ Superstar, which not only reinterprets character but also expands the vocal and emotional possibilities of the role. Musical theatre with its heightened emotional registers and performative fluidity is particularly well suited to this kind of boundary pushing, and Echo thinks that we're at the beginning of a much larger shift in which casting is not only about representation but also about reimagining the dramaturgy and effective logic of musicals themselves. Then in answer, I think, to my question about race, Echo said that she keeps coming back to how race is always present, whether it's acknowledged or not. It's not something that can't be added in later as an afterthought. It's embedded in the structures of performance, reception, and authorship. It's always intersectional. When we talk about casting, embodiment, voice, or even genre conventions, we're also talking about histories of racialization, who is allowed to play which roles, whose voices are deemed authentic in inverted commas, and how racial identity shapes audience expectations. Even in productions that might not explicitly name race, it's still operating often in the assumptions about neutrality, universality, or tradition. And she thinks that musical theatre, like opera, is a space where these tensions surface powerfully, so part of the work is making that visibility conscious and interrogating what's framed as inverted commas normal or inverted commas classic, and how those frameworks exclude or exoticize performers of colour. And then there's just one final answer. Question 4. In both opera and musical theatre, there's a long history of women performing male roles, whether in breeches roles. Have we already had? Yeah, I've already said that. Okay, so we're done. Thank you, Echo. Sorry we couldn't hear you, but thank you so much for those answers.
And thank you for a fantastic panel.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm not in the right mood.